He's very, very, very poor.
Today is Thursday, December 17th, 2020. Welcome back. This is the last Dojo Live of the year. I'm Tulio Siragusa, broadcasting from Southern California. I'm joined today by my co-host, Kim Lantis in Hermosillo, Mexico, and Carlos Ponce, who's a little bit delayed in his connection, so hopefully we won't have too much of an issue with that. Hey, Carlos, welcome back.
The one with the worst internet.
Yeah, remember that show? That was hilarious. That should go down as one of those blunder shows. Ryan, welcome to the show. We have Ryan Jones with VMware. This is why we do this. So how exciting for you to be part of the last show of 2020. So, no pressure. Make it interesting.
Super excited.
We're going to be talking about something really valuable today in terms of actually determining the value of a product before building one. How do you do that? So before we go into that, let's get to know you a little bit. Ryan, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, of course. So my background in terms of coming into tech was a little bit different than what others have done before. So I ended up in school over at Babson College in London School of Economics. I spent most of my time focusing on finance and entrepreneurship, and ended up over at Goldman Sachs helping manage about $5 billion of multi-asset class portfolios on discretion. We built out a bunch of financial products, which was really interesting, and all the learnings that we talked today could actually be leveraged outside of even technology. But what I realized and what I was really interested in was building technology products. And so I left and did a startup with a few friends in New York City, where we focused on making it possible for people to view, save, share, and purchase products through images. So a lot of what you see now in House or in Instagram or in Facebook, we were doing about a decade ago. We focused on doing that with major publishers like Condé Nast and Time Inc. What we'll talk about later is kind of how to determine that value. What we realized is there's a few big areas that we totally missed in terms of how to approach and build this product and build a valuable product. And so the startup we decided to shut down, and ended up going over to a company called Pivotal Labs, where we really focused on helping and enabling companies on how to determine value and build that value quickly. So we worked with all the major Fortune 500 companies, and then we also worked with a lot of the quick growing startups to help kind of coach them and teach them through that entire approach. And then from there, I ended up in Pivotal's R&D space, focusing on server infrastructure tech. And what I really started to do as my bread and butter is creating new products. And so I would take an area and an opportunity and try to determine and figure out what that value is, build out a product, build out a team. And once we started going from there, I would pass that off to a team that would continue to execute and grow that sort of space and move on to the next product. We ended up going public. And then more recently, about a year ago, we got purchased by VMware. And then from there, I continued to do the same sort of role, but I moved from kind of lower level server infrastructure tech, like things like Kubernetes. So I created our first offering of Kubernetes across VMware and Pivotal, to now what's called Spring, which is one of the largest frameworks when it comes to anyone who's using Java. And so I'm building out products with Microsoft called Azure Spring Cloud, as well as running all of our Spring Cloud services. Throughout that time, I've taught over 25 different PMs, launched over 50 different products with millions of different users, and within a few of them, the most recent ones within the first year, having a pipeline of over $100 million of revenue. And so now we're here today.
Sounds great. So, the challenges of being in a product development, product management role are endless, right? There's companies always challenged with pursuing or pushing the envelope without necessarily breaking the bank. And that's a very challenging thing to do. And there's a lot of methodologies people use. So I'm curious to learn about this methodology that you're using, which doesn't require actually building out or anything yet until you actually can prove value. So let's go right into it. Kim, will you introduce the topic today and kick off the conversation with Ryan, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you for being here, Ryan, and congratulations on the acquisition. And that's very exciting, right?
Definitely.
So your chosen topic today is determine a valuable product without building one. Essentially, stop wasting your time and money, quickly determine value and the fastest way to market. So I'm really looking forward, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers who happen to be developers themselves and project managers are going to appreciate today's talk as well. What I'm hearing you, and I don't know if this is a true quote of his or not, but it has been attributed to Thomas Edison of, I haven't failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work.
Yes.
So my question for you is, would you like to first talk about what won't work and why, and then move into what you found does work as far as not wasting time and money when building?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's I think that's where a lot of people run into the issues. And so what we've seen, and especially working with a lot of these large companies and even startups or individuals who are entrepreneurs, is a lot of them jump to the solution. They start to focus on what it is that they think is extremely valuable without going out and doing their own research. Or you have someone who's a high up exec that makes a decision, and then you have an entire team of maybe hundreds of people that go on and executing. And they may take even a year or 2 years to get something out. And they don't actually, as you were talking about in terms of finding all different ways to learn, and the failures are that method, the speed at which you can go and find what does not work will then help speed up the way in which you find that value. And so it's really fascinating to see how so many people miss kind of what should be the very first step on how to actually approach and find that value, which is really doing what we call exploratory research. And so everyone will go and have their solution, build that solution, put it out to market, and they spend years sometimes trying to figure out why it's not working. And they really miss that first step that could even take the span of weeks to actually get that learning and help you pivot and find that value quickly. And so that big part of what people need to be doing in that exploratory research is first and foremost trying to figure out, is it a problem worth solving? And when people go and they'll hear people talk about problems, it needs to be an individual's top 3 problem. If it's not their top 3, it's really not worth going after. And so for the example of the previous startup that we had, which was called Pixby, yes, it'd be nice to be able to see something in an image and be able to buy that product or get the information on that product. But for most individuals, that isn't the top 3 issues that they have when they're viewing any form of media and when they're trying to be entertained or whatever it may be. And then the other part that people miss out on is actually the trends that are associated with it. So even if it's a big problem, it may be a big problem now, but where everything's moving, it may not be actually that big of a problem in the near future. So for us, we focused on digital magazines because what was nice is we could embed directly into them. And we assumed that we'd get 20 million monthly active users on day 1. But in actuality, we ended up with 20,000. And so the issue there was that there's a ton of subscribers for digital magazines, but the amount of people that actually open them is far less. And the trends at that time were moving all the way from digital magazines, and they're going to web, but even more so from like blogs and web, they're moving to social media. So they're going, of course, going to be Instagram influencers, TikTok, Facebook, and we can't embed ourselves in there. And so the opportunity was going to get smaller and smaller as we continued down that path and as the years progressed. And so we didn't spend that upfront work to really figure out what those problems were and if there's a problem we're solving, and then also where those trend lines were. And so for individuals, there are specific methods of how to actually go and accomplish this. And what's great is you don't need engineers, and you don't necessarily need a full team to actually go and figure all this information out on day 1.
So Ryan, let's talk about this a little bit. I mean, there's a few methodologies, well-known methodology. You've got a lean canvas where you go very wide with various scenarios, and then you validate, invalidate, and that takes time. I mean, you could easily spend 6 months just validating a value proposition.
Yeah.
And then you've got the Osterwilder canvas, which takes more into account the business value, and it's a little bit more strategic, tying to the business, which shortens that cycle a little bit. And then, of course, you've got people who just, use the gut approach to things. I've just been in this industry 20 years. I know exactly what needs to happen. That's always a very dangerous strategy, very dangerous strategy. So what has worked? How do you go about it in such a way where you don't waste all that time, which obviously there's costs involved with that, and yet still be very effective? What's the methodology you guys use? What's working?
Yes, and I think that's a great point. So what's really interesting and what we saw when we were kind of teaching these different groups on how to do this approach is that it's very exhausting to actually do this right. it's much easier to just go and say, we're going to go from what we know and what we already have from our experience and make some decisions, build something, get it out to market, and just keep going through. Actually going and doing that critical thinking at every single step of the way can really be difficult for individuals, because it's constantly questioning everything that you know every single day. And so a lot of where this stems from is from that lean product development, which is kind of one of those agile methodologies that's out there, and mixed in with user-centered design. And so there's actually a great book out there called Sprint by Google Ventures. And they actually, in the span of a week, they give multiple examples on how people were able to go and do this validation in a very cost-effective way to get that information very quickly. So you don't have to wait those 6 months to get that. You can do it all in the span of a week. And you don't need engineers, especially nowadays. There's a lot of no-code options where you as an individual can go and do all this validation by yourself. The other big part that I do see a lot of people mess up, though, is how you ask the questions and get that information. So especially if you're an entrepreneur, or if you have some vested interest in making sure that you see some positive outcome, the questions that you tend to ask are going to be very biased. And so there's now a lot of psychology around how to actually ask these questions. And so there's a few different materials that are out there. Like, one is called Talking to Humans. It's free. You can just get the PDF online. That was written by one of my coworkers. And then the other, there's a bunch of documentarians that are out there that say, how do they get information without letting the individual know exactly what they're searching for? And so when you're talking and trying to validate a sort of problem, you shouldn't even be talking about your product at all. And so people need to be spending that time to figure out how they can ask the questions without biasing, and help driving people to the answers that they actually want as the interviewer, but actually get the truth and the data that's coming from those individuals.
Interesting. So can you give us some use case examples of where you apply this?
Yes. So there's a few different tiers. There's a few different, there's a few different tiers of how this works, right? And so there's, at the very beginning, the formation of trying to figure out a product. And then once you have that product up and running. And so it starts to change in terms of how you may make those approaches and the size of which you're going after it. The beginning is always my favorite, just because it's so wide. And so like an example is, we'll work with someone like Home Depot. They go, this is an area that we would like to tackle. We're not sure how we are going to make money, but we know that we need to start making revenue in this new sort of space. And so we'll go and try to figure out and talk to the individuals that they're going for, so those specific personas, and do some of the that questioning to understand what their real problems are and what they need to have solved for them. What's interesting, though, is a lot of people will go and they'll focus on a given persona, and if they start to figure out that those aren't the right problems for them, what they'll do is they'll start trying to figure out what the right problems are for that persona. The other option is that you may actually have the wrong persona that you're going after. And a lot of people don't think of that as a way to actually pivot. Instead of pivoting your product and your problem because of what the persona said, is just actually pivot your persona. And so that starts to become kind of a really wide funnel in the way that people approach and try to get that information. And once you go and you can actually find a problem that's worth solving, then you actually go to that framing standpoint of figuring out what the right solution is for their problems. And a question that it tends to come out with a really interesting outcome is really asking people, if you had a magic wand, what would you have as that solution to help you? And so just leaving it to them and see where it goes. And you don't have to talk to 20, 30, or 100 people. You start to get convergence around that 5 to 8 people, which is great. And so a lot of people think that this is going to take a lot of time. You're going to have a lot of these interviews, but only a few interviews can actually give you a lot of insight in terms of approaching these things. Once you have a product actually up and running that is valuable, the questions start to become, what are the things that are our biggest risks? Where are our biggest values? And then how do we get the right solution to those individuals? And you can focus that on a specific feature level or a specific division of that product that you're building out. And that becomes a lot easier because you can get a lot more focused on what it is that you're trying to do, and you can provide them with a lot of different potential solutions and directions that they could go.
Nice.
That's really exciting, Ryan, and thank you. I guess my question is, and what I'm hearing is anybody who wants to do this can do this. But let's say you find something from your research that's really interesting, or you discover a new shift. What do you do, or what techniques do you have within your actual team and decision makers to make that push? When you come up against not just external resistance, but the internal resistance of like, no, really listen to this. Do you have advice of how to help move your discoveries up the chain, let's say, for lack of a better way to describe it?
Yeah, and I think what you were just talking about brought up something that's really interesting that a lot of people forget is when you do this validation, it never ends. And so when you're doing interviews, even if you're focusing on specific features, you should always be poking at your foundational layer, right, of what your assumptions are and what your learnings are, because at any time those things can change. And so I think to your point, there may be something where we're on a certain direction. Maybe like a great example is we built out this product called Cloud Foundry, which really enabled developers to, with one command, deploy their applications to this whatever given server infrastructure. And so it took out a ton of work. So it went from taking 6 months to deploy an application to 30 seconds. And what ended up happening is there's this new technology, Kubernetes, that came into play and actually really turned the entire industry on its head. And what we needed to do was realize that our foundational layer of what we had is now actually gone. And so we had to make sure that we started questioning that and then go around and figure out how do we go into this new paradigm shift. And so what's really big when you're talking about how do we influence others and make sure that we get everyone on board, I mean, it really does come down to, especially for product managers, is data, right? How do you get enough information and data, and how do you have I think from a great product manager, one of the key key characteristics that individuals need to have is communication. And so throughout the entire process, you need to make sure that you're communicating with all leadership and all stakeholders in exactly what you're doing, how you're doing it. And the same way that you would have a roadmap for your product, you should have a roadmap for your research, and providing information along the way and using that data to help them make decisions, or if they can enable the team itself to make those decisions, that's really impressive. And so we actually had a few instances where, say, companies would come from Russia or Korea or kind of all over to come to Silicon Valley to learn this method. They would come in with a predisposition of what they wanted to actually build. Within about a week, we would tell them this doesn't make any sense, right? And we'd be working directly with them on it. And so they had to go and work with this group that already put millions upon millions of dollars aside for budget to build this specific product. And so having those conversations, it really helped to bring that information from customers, to bring the data from all the trends that you're seeing in the marketplace, to bring that information and data around whatever those competitors may be. And not only that, start bringing up what could be a better space to focus our time and effort on. And so it is really the product manager's job to bring all of that information together and make sure everyone's coming along during that process, and it's not just at the very beginning and at the very end.
Carlos, I think you had a question.
Ryan, I got yeah, exactly. Well, I hope you can hear me. I think I fixed my connectivity by switching networks, but anyway, just let me know. Great. So Ryan, there's this idea about, and I always say that to our guests that I'm asking my questions from the layman terms type of viewpoint, because I'm not an engineer, and I don't have as much experience as Julio has in engineering, with an engineering background. So my question is this idea of apps for everyone. You mentioned no code or low code, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So would you say that creating, for example, native custom quality apps using an automated platform can help a company, let's say, meet a market challenge by maybe pivoting to a different audience and business model?
Yeah. So I think it's a great first step. I mean, over time, you'll have to build something custom in most cases, depending on the size and what you're going after. But in terms of the validation at the very beginning, any company can go about this in terms of leveraging a no-code option or something even just designed out, and you can put up a web page and do some fake advertisements on Instagram or Facebook to go and get that validation of if there's actually a good solution around it. What's really fascinating is actually some of the kind of what we call sniff tests on how to go and figure out if you're on the right track. One of those is if you actually build a bad product from a UI and UX perspective, but customers still want to use it, that is always a great sniff test. The other is looking for hacks. So like an example of something that we were focused on is that people would use, say, Excel spreadsheets, or it take them hours, and they're willing to take those hours just to put in to get something up and running. Those are good places to know, like, get that sniff test and then go focus on something.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Sorry.
So Ryan, just to quickly recap, what I'm hearing is, and this is something you mentioned earlier, don't go into building a product with a solution mindset, trying to solve a problem or trying to create an outcome right away. It sounds as though what you need to do is become really good investigators, right? I mean, everything is an hypothesis until it's either proven correctly or wrong, right? And that's the mindset, at least in the lean methodology. Everything is an hypothesis. Oh, what if we do this? Well, that's an hypothesis. We have to prove it out, right? So
absolutely.
With that being said, sometimes there's the challenge in organizations, especially larger companies, the pressure to push new products out into the market and balancing that against the realities of, well, you don't want to just push product for the sake of pushing product. You want to actually create something of value. How are you guys balancing that within your culture?
That's a great point. I think it's interesting depending on the size of the company. So I'd say at VMware, we are a very large organization and we have a lot of different divisions and a lot of different products. Our space that we're focused on is also relatively interesting because we've been around so long. We're integrated at almost every major company at this point. But our technology in some instances is actually relatively old. And so we have groups who are focused on maintaining that older infrastructure and those older products that need to continue because it can take decades sometimes for these companies to move over to some of the new technology. But then we have different groups and divisions that are focused on those new products. And so what we've seen is we do actually have to have some clear separation of those different product teams on who's focused on what, and also the people that are specifically working on them. And so there's this whole concept of people who are like explorers versus settlers. And so you actually have to change the individuals that are on those products depending on the needs of that product and the customers that are associated with them. And so someone like myself, I guess I'm more in that explorer camp. And so I'm used leveraged across the division to go and help find where those new opportunities are, build out those new products, get customers on board, help them understand kind of the new direction that's going. And then as soon as that starts to get to the point of a sustainable product, we bring in other individuals that are going to actually go and make sure that that's sustained for a long period of time. And so there is definitely that pressure of continuing to push and continuing to drive. I think what's also fascinating, if you do have the ability, right, we're going to go as fast as we can to do that validation. And along the way, you're going to be wrong at times. And so I'm really making sure that you continue this process throughout the entire life cycle. You shouldn't be celebrating a release just because you released something. You should be excited with the fact because every single release is an opportunity to learn. And so you should be excited about getting the learnings from that release versus the release itself going out. And so what our goal is really to get those releases out as fast as possible. And actually at Pivotal, our customers started to get a little frustrated because we were doing it so often. And so we had to actually go into a better cadence of quarterly so that they could start setting everything up to update all their software. Because before we were almost doing weekly releases in server infrastructure, which is on-premise, a lot of the work that we were doing, that was unheard of. And so we had to actually change based off of the way our customers worked to get information, to get new technology out, but still is much faster than everyone else out there.
Thank you. Ryan, what I'm hearing a lot is this sense of humility, right? This willingness to learn from other people. You mentioned earlier VMware being extremely large. You mentioned bringing in and helping teams, I think, from Russia, and I don't recall the other countries that you mentioned, which leads to my question of what have you learned working cross-culturally with cultures distinctly different than what you're used to? Thank you, Tulia. China and Korea, I think, is what you brought in as well. And we tend to vary greatly. And I see a lot of these elements of cultural differences coming into play with what it is that you do. The need to provide negative feedback. Are we direct with that? Are we indirect with that? What are we used to, and what's our approach to persuading someone, right? Is it more applications, or is it kind of more on a principle side, right? This is what we have to do with it, or this is why we have to do it. So what have you learned, and how have you personally perhaps had to have shifted your own outlook or adjusted yourself to work effectively with other people?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So during the Pivotal Labs times, we were, of course, hired to go in and help coach them and work in a completely different environment and completely different company. When I was driving out the Kubernetes offering, it was actually a joint product between Pivotal and VMware. So actually, we have different cultures at Pivotal and then VMware. So I got an insight to that. And then now one of the products that I'm running, Azure Spring Cloud, it's now in between VMware and Microsoft. So I'm kind of continuously sat in between multiple companies pretty much for the past 5 years. One of the points that comes out of it, there's this, I guess, methodology called extreme programming. And in that, they talk about courage. And one of the things about when they're talking about courage is really being able to speak up and give the information and not being worried about sharing that data. And so when you're working with these companies and someone really high up goes and says, this is what we're doing, but the team finds that information as they're going through those validation methods, having the courage to go and tell someone that maybe that information or where they started was wrong, and here's the new information, and then providing that new insights is really important. And I think a lot of it is really getting rid of that ego in terms of what you have and what your thoughts are, because over time, you're also going to learn new methodologies and new ways to approach things. And whatever you may be, you have a really strong opinion on, you may have to let go of that opinion very quickly. And so I think another approach in lean product development is like strong opinions loosely held. And so you do have to make decisions. You do have to drive a team forward. But at any time of new data and information, you have to be really ready to pivot and give up that thing. And you have to be okay with being wrong. And setting that precedence for others is really important if you're coaching or helping them. But then also when it comes to leadership, they may have some insights that you actually didn't know and didn't have. And so you need to take that information and look at everything. I think that was talked about earlier, right? It's very much a scientific method. And so hypotheses are with everything. You need to go and get that data and information. And if there's something new, you really need to kind of alter your approach and get rid of that ego.
Interesting.
Thank you.
We're coming up on time, Ryan. It sounds as though if you go back maybe 20, 30 years in tech, the push was who can get a product out, right? And most products didn't change sometimes for years.
Absolutely.
So the mindset of building a solution that you can get adoption on, it was the big drive, right? So you build people coming up the ranks in product. This is the mindset. It wasn't necessarily a mindset of curiosity, of ingenuity. It was more like, let's get something that we can sell and make money with and push it out there, right? So,
right.
But what I'm hearing is that's like dinosaur thinking now, right? You've got to shift to more of a curious mindset. So how do you go about balancing when you hire folks, for example? How do you determine who's got that curious mindset versus those who might be more, I just want to get it done? Because there's value in the person who wants to get it done, but it sounds like you have to balance that out. So we're up on time, like a minute, but if you could share that with us, what's working, that'd be great.
Of course. Yeah. And so we definitely need people that can execute extremely well. And that's really important. But in terms of balancing that, a lot of times when I'm interviewing for PMs, going through some form of case studies and seeing how they approach that and trying to figure out where their cut lines are. We actually had this great one called a ping pong interview, where it was, how do you match people to go and help them find ping pong? And we asked them, like, what is the smallest way and how would you determine what the best method is? And some of the best answers were those that used no technology whatsoever. And it may just be a flag that's sitting on your desk that says, I'm ready to play. And so giving those case studies and seeing how people operate and how they approach it has been the best way for us to get an understanding of what that mindset is for people and how they're going to go about learning. And then a lot of it too is figuring out, if you role play as potential customers, how they ask you questions, and trying to make sure that there's no biases that's associated with it, and that they're really trying to get data and information from you.
Great. Thanks for sharing that with us. Sounds similar to when we do these mini hackathons hiring engineers. We don't only just look whether they can produce the code, but we're actually looking if they ask questions and they can engage and are curious, which is more important than actually just being someone who can be in a room by themselves and build something. We want to work as a team. So sounds like teamwork is important. It's been great to have you with us, Ryan. It was the last. It's the last show of the year, and it didn't disappoint. I really
show of the year
with you.
I'm excited for 21.
Yes, 2021, make it a better year for sure. But it's been great to have you. I just want to remind everyone watching, when we return in January, the 1 p.m. show will be at 12 noon Pacific. We're going to have a new time at 12 noon Pacific. And then the 10 a.m. show on Wednesday will continue at 10 a.m. We might add an additional date to the 10 a.m. show, probably Tuesday and Thursday. So a lot to look forward to in 2021. Many more Dojo Lives, many more great guests like Ryan. So don't forget, join us. Mark your calendars, and we want to wish everyone a happy holiday season and a safe, happy new year. And until we see you again, thank you so much for being with us this year. It's been a great year. Anything you want to add, Carlos or Kim?
No, not really. I mean, as you know, Tulio, I usually kind of talk about what's going to happen next week. But the only thing that's happening next week is we're all celebrating being here and healthy. Right?
Exactly.
So, well, the only thing is left for me to do is just thank our guest, Ryan, for having agreed to be with us today. It was great to have you. And I apologize for the little glitches on my connectivity, but this is how it is in this day and age. So thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Kim. And thank you, Tulio, as ever. I'll see you in 2021.
Thank you.
Cheers.